So just to, if you are coming in the last 5 minutes or so, I'm going to put a link in the chat so that you can see there. It is a link to some files, some documents in a file that I have for y'all that are relevant to today's presentation. So if you're interested in those materials, please take a minute to open up the link, and you are welcome to download and view those materials there. Thank you all so much for being with me today. My name is Anna Hammons, and today what we're covering is we're talking about helping your students get the most out of their reading. And so just a few notes on engaging today. I strongly encourage y'all to, respond to questions in the chat. I'm going to be asking y'all a couple of questions through the chat. So that would be really great if y'all could participate there, share some of your ideas and thoughts. There's also ways that you can react. I've got a lot of y'all pulled up here. You are welcome to keep your video on or off depending on your comfort level. I do love seeing some faces though. So if you like to keep it on, please do. And then we also have a poll that's going to be conducted during the presentation as well. So when that comes up, don't forget to, whatever you select, make sure you also hit submit. I'm guilty of forgetting that myself. So make sure that you hit submit so that your answer goes through for that part of the presentation. I see a couple people are still entering. I'm going to wait maybe another minute or so, and then I'm going to drop the link again in the chat. So if you've already seen it, you can ignore it. But I'm going to drop that in there again, just in a few moments to get some of our people who are still coming in. Now, just to briefly introduce myself before we get started, my name is Anna Hammons. I work with LSU's Center for Academic Success. I'm a program coordinator with their Academic Engagement and Achievement Unit. I've been here for about a year and a half with here at LSU. If you would like to ask any questions or contact me after the presentation, you are welcome to by sending me an email address, email at ahammons1@lsu.edu. I do think it's good to note though, before getting into this presentation about reading, is that before I came to the Center for Academic Success here at LSU, I actually worked as a high school English teacher in East Baton Rouge Parish for 8 years. So I've spent a lot of time with students and helping them, with their comprehension and reading strategies. Also, if you would like to contact the Center for Academic Success in general for any other, inquiries that you may have, our email address is cas@lsu.edu. You can actually reach me through either one if you would like. So you're welcome to get down both of those if you would like. Now, I think I'm going to quickly just drop in that link again. Again, for those who are joining us late, that link has access to a few documents that are relevant to the presentation today. So what we're kind of really doing today and what we're trying to get out of this is that at the end of this presentation, y'all should be able to help students kind of develop a reading plan using very specific strategies. In fact, I'm going to be spending, I would say, probably the bulk of the presentation talking about very specific strategies that we use with our students here at CAS. And then also help them identify maybe which students would be most beneficial for students based on the type of reading they're trying to do, the purpose and goal behind that reading, and the expectations from their instructors of what they need to do with that reading when they're done. And so this is our first reflection, and for reflections, I would actually like you to respond to those in the chat, which is what I was saying before. I would love to hear from y'all in the chat. And the first question is, what is your recreational reading process? And what I mean by that is when you're sitting down to just read a book that you enjoy, or just any sort of text that you enjoy reading, what does that look like for you? Are you, where do you go? Like for me, I sit in the most comfortable recliner in my living room. I have a blanket. I probably have a snack because I know I'm going to be there for a while. And I just, fire up the Kindle and I get right into it. I know I've been using my Kindle a lot lately because that's how I've been borrowing library books. So for me, these are kind of some of the things that go into when I think I'm settling in to read something that I'm going to just enjoy. That's what that looks like for me. So what does that look like for you? What are some of the things you do when you settle in for some recreational reading? So in bed or on the couch near the wood stove, that would be nice. Get lost in the book, ignoring everything else. Audiobooks are for walking outside. I've been doing that a lot lately as well. It's actually been really, really nice. So I love reading on the patio, hardback books, listening to audiobooks while doing chores. That's a really good idea too. Audiobooks during chores, weather's nice outside on the deck or porch, on the couch with tea, on my deck in the sun, at the pool. That's really nice. Although I always get nervous about like bringing my Kindle near the pool, it stresses me out. But for definitely hardback books, I love it. Notorious for staying up late, no self-control. I saw this meme lately that was like, oh, I've been having a hard time sleeping. And someone says, oh, why don't you just stop at the end of the chapter? I'm like, you do that? No, I'm definitely guilty of that myself. You just keep reading, staying up late, audiobook while driving. Yep, doing the same thing. Couch, read half the book, then forget to finish it. See, I'm bad. Like I was saying, I'll stay up late and I'll just keep reading. Anywhere and everywhere, audiobooks, hard copy books, highlighting, underlining, and annotating. You see, I will do that sometimes too, although I find myself doing it less on the Kindle. I don't know if it's a technology thing or what, but hardback, oh, well, while driving, not really. I hope not. Anyone else want to share just kind of what does that look like for you? Two different types of book going, one nonfiction and one fiction. That's so funny. I do the same thing because I like my nonfiction in audiobooks, but I like my fiction in, the Kindle or the reading, format. So that's funny. I do the same thing. Okay, great. Well, thank you all so much for sharing all of those. And because actually there's kind of a part 2 to this reflection, because now I'm going to ask you to think about how does that differ from your academic reading process? And when I say academic reading, I mean scholarly articles, readings you may be doing for work, things like that. Does it look the same? And if it doesn't look the same, what are you changing? What, is the difference between those two approaches for you? Taking notes, sometimes having to read the same line or paragraph 10 times to really get it, have to be at a desk so I don't fall asleep. Generally coffee is there. Yep, absolutely. Looks the same. Post notes for sure. Lots of coffee, usually at the computer or printed, highlighter ready, using the highlighter on the computer. At your desk, must be hard copy to annotate. Could never listen to an academic piece on audio, want a hard copy to take notes on. I'm seeing a trend of like hard copy with notes and highlighting, preparing a feedback report sometimes. Do files and documents open, saving parts for future use. I'm bad about that, but sometimes I never come back to that tab, but you have like 50 tabs saved. I do that. Does look different, but don't get so lost while doing work reading. Yes, for sure. Flip around to connect dots, looking up background information or context to take notes and to help you annotate. A lot more skimming to prepare. Hard copy as well. Have to be mentally prepared for it. Need Post-it notes and pens next to me. I absolutely agree. I kind of have to, it's almost like I have to kind of talk myself into it, and I set up my environment completely different. I sit at a desk myself when it comes to these sorts of readings. I'm definitely not comfortable in my recliner or anything. And then skimming for sure. Absolutely. So a lot of us here as professionals needing quiet, like I'm seeing here that there is a very different approach between your recreational reading and your academic reading. We know that these different types of reading require a different type of process. But I've actually got another question for y'all here. And this is the second reflection. I know y'all work with students. And so I would actually like y'all to share, when you ask your students about their reading process, or when you see them reading, how do you see them approach it? What do they do? What do they look like when they're approaching their reading? And especially if you can speak to when they're kind of doing their more academic or, content heavy reading, how are they doing it? Pam, so Pam, that's you, that's not the students? No difference. They approach it all like recreational reading, not at all slogging through it word for word. They try to just hop in.
Mm-hmm. And when I posted, I was saying that's what I hear from students when I ask them about their, reading for school. I have to make myself do it. I get bored. I get lost. I just quit.
Absolutely. That is definitely a theme. I don't see the students with eye movement. Okay, so they're really not even, they're kind of just looking at the page. They're not even going across the words, lots of hesitation, feeling overwhelmed for sure. Sometimes they don't do it. They get frustrated when they don't understand immediately and quit. Yes, that is definitely something we've been hearing from students too. You can see them shut down mentally and physically, and then they try to skip and just do what they have to do to submit a grade. And they try to use summaries, Spark Notes, et cetera, to minimize the amount that they have to go through, and they don't think it's necessary. Going through it at the sentence level, not understanding or remembering what they've just read, absolutely. They think reading versus papers are optional, yes. And in fact, some of the things I'm going to share about student perspective is going to definitely ring true for a lot of y'all, I can tell already. And it depends on what the reading's used for. Yes, absolutely. Core content versus literature versus reading articles. Absolutely. They change their approaches too sometimes. So skimming. Several students who don't know that they even had a textbook in the class, and then it ends up being online. Yes, we have heard the same thing from a lot of students. We'll ask them, what textbook are you using? And they say, oh, I'm not sure I have one. We may ask like, oh, well, do you have something like, Mastering Biology? They're like, yeah, we use Mastering Biology in my class. That's where your textbook is. So we hear the same thing from our students too, not dedicating the time needed. And some may not read with a purpose, understanding why they're reading, knowing what the assessment is. I'm loving all these responses because I got to tell you, we're hearing a lot of the same thing and seeing a lot of things from our students, but it's just what we're going to actually specifically address in this presentation today is going to address a lot of what you're seeing your students do, because as professionals, we know that we need to change our approaches depending on the type of reading we're doing. But as y'all acknowledge, a lot of students don't know to do that, and they don't know how to go about being a lot more strategic in their academic and core content reading so that they can be a lot more efficient and effective with it. So hopefully it becomes less of a chore for them. Oh, also consider reading as studying. Yes, that is true, because we'll ask students, how are you studying? And they'll often say, I read through my notes. So that is definitely a common thing that we hear as well. And so a few things to expect from this presentation today. First thing I'm going to talk about is the importance in the student perspective. I got a lot of it here. It's going to get reinforced in a moment. And then as well as specifically our pre-reading strategies that we use, our strategies that we use for during reading, and our post-reading strategies as well that we share with our students. And so one of the first things of why this is so important, why it's so important to very clearly and concretely address reading strategies with students is because they are often very reluctant when it comes to their reading assignments. I saw that in the chat and what a lot of y'all were saying and what you saw from your students. I can attest to it in coaching sessions, academic coaching sessions, where they'll say, a student will say they'll have a hard time, understanding content in the class. And I'll ask, well, have you used your textbook? Do you do any reading in there to kind of help you better understand content? And the groan is sometimes there. The reluctance is very clear, but I think a lot of that reluctance is because they don't have a clear approach and they don't have a clear strategy. In fact, there was a study done in 2019. They surveyed a couple hundred undergraduate students. And I think a lot of the student perspective will resonate and reflect a lot of what y'all were sharing in the chat, is that the undergraduates actually reported that they do believe reading is important. They know it's something that they probably should be doing. And yet a lot of them admit that they do not often complete these reading assignments. They admit, I know it's important, but I'm still not doing it. And then a lot of students also indicated that they thought they could probably make at least a C in the course without doing the reading assignments. So they tried to get by without doing them because of that as well. And then also point 3, students also believe that many professors actually assign too much reading. I know I hear that from students a lot. They're like, oh, there's so much reading in this class, it's overwhelming. And then they also feel like their reading assignments are boring. A lot of them are not very excited about reading from a textbook, and I can understand that. So, you know, it's something that's it's a challenging task for a lot of people. So that's what we're hearing from a lot of our students. And this study definitely reflected that. And so to kind of continue on why this is so important is also because, especially with the shift to so much online learning after, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic, everything started, a lot of our online learning classes have required a lot of independent reading. We've definitely noticed an uptick in that, that being assigned. And so we need to help students understand what it takes to accomplish these reading tasks effectively so they can digest this content. So we've noticed more demand, kind of more of this happening in class. And then in addition to that, number 3 of why it's so important to teach this is when I have sat down with students in coaching appointments and taught them about reading strategies, their response has been so positive, the feedback. They feel so much more confident about approaching these very dense, difficult texts. And they also are a lot more willing. I worked with I believe he was a graduate student for chemistry, and he was getting assigned scholarly articles to read, and he just didn't have a lot of experience with that. He wasn't sure how to approach it. I had him come in, he was actually sent to me by a colleague, and he came in, I told him, bring in one of your scholarly articles. And we sat down together and we talked about the steps and how to approach that article and how to read it effectively. And when we were done, he was just like, wow, I didn't know that there was a way to read other than just sitting down and trying to read things like off the bat. And he was like, I feel so much better. Like, I feel like I can really kind of do this now on my own a lot better. So that's just another third reason why it's so important to teach it, is because when you teach students these things and they can really take them and use them, they feel so much more confident and they are going to engage with that text a lot more effectively. And so this is our poll. We have one poll in today's presentation. So I've broken down the reading process into 3 steps. This is going to be really familiar, especially if you know something like SQR3. This is kind of a note that there needs to be a 3-step reading process, the things you do in order to prepare for the reading, what you do while you're reading, and then the strategies you use post-reading. So I would like to launch that poll and to ask you what you believe is the most important step of the reading process. We got a lot of votes coming in. See, about 75% of people have voted. Okay, we're going to go ahead and end voting, end polling, excuse me, and share results. So as you can see, most of y'all said, 63% said pre-reading, 6% said during reading, and 31% said post-reading. So with that in mind, actually, the majority of y'all were correct. Pre-reading is the most important step. And we actually do know that because pre-reading is essentially scaffolding. There was actually one of the studies that really kicked off this understanding and helped us know this was conducted in 1987 with middle schoolers. And they had middle school students read an article, a text about baseball. And to check their comprehension, the students after reading had to, with a model and figurines, had to recreate what happened in the text concerning baseball. And what they found after having all these students read this text and try to check their comprehension was the students who had high reading ability but no prior baseball knowledge, and the students who had a lower reading ability and no baseball knowledge, both of them had equal amounts of difficulty in replicating what happened. But those students with high reading ability and high baseball knowledge and those students with lower reading ability and high baseball knowledge were much more successful than the other groups. So it really started standing out then that what you do to prepare for reading, what kind of prior knowledge, the context that you have is extremely important. And this has been obviously this has absolutely been checked even since then. In 2019, they had a group of high school students of a variety of reading levels, and they had them take a test of 44 terms, just do you know these terms about ecology? And then after they took that test, they then had to do a reading on ecosystems, and they checked their comprehension after that. And what they found is how well students scored on that reading check really correlated with how well they performed on the definition test, the term test that they took in advance. If they scored a 60% or higher on that term test, they already knew a good amount of terms associated with ecology. They did well on the comprehension check for the reading. But if they scored a 59% or lower on that term test, they did not score as well. So their performance on comprehension really was strongly linked to their prior knowledge and what they knew before the reading, and not really as well connected with their perceived reading ability. So pre-reading, we know, is the most important step for Gloria. It's not a trick question, I just saw that. But pre-reading, we know, is the probably the most important step when it comes to the reading process. And so what we're going to do now is actually talk about some of these pre-reading strategies. And so one of the ways that we suggest people, students preview is, especially if they are using a textbook, is they should really review the table of contents. Maybe if there's a chapter introduction at the beginning of the chapter where they kind of have an overview, or a chapter summary at the end of the chapter, look at the learning objectives, and then also to look at the subheadings, visuals, and key terms. I saw a lot of you mention when it comes to your own academic reading, you skim and you look at things like that. That is such an important skill, and it is a very good way to help you pre-read. Essentially, students, you want them to try to build that framework, build that context as much as they possibly can before they go into that reading. I've also even suggested to students, like if you're reading a textbook because you're trying to better understand a lecture, skim through those notes, look through those notes again, and really try to identify what do you want to focus on. You know, really try to build that context as much as possible before you go into the reading. The next thing that's really important that I also saw a lot of you mention was the idea of purpose. They need to define their purpose for reading. So again, this is another good example if they're reading in a textbook or a scholarly article that has a lot of subheadings and things like that. One of the things I tell them is turn those subheadings into questions. You know, if the subheading says inductive reasoning, your question could be as simple as, what is inductive reasoning? You know, if it talks about, you know, establishing controls, using predictions, why is it important that I use predictions? Why is it important that I establish controls? And then to even kind of skim and preview that page and think, how does inductive reasoning connect to testing your hypotheses? How does inductive reasoning connect to making predictions? You know, using the subheadings as a guide to create purpose while they are reading. That's a really good trick that I like to share with a lot of my students, especially if they're reading textbooks. Also, it's really good to articulate why this information is significant. That could be, my instructor talked about inductive reasoning in class, and I do not feel like I, you know, really understand what that's about or what that really means. It could also be, you know, at the end of this, I know I have to take a quiz, or even at the end of this, it could be something like they need to read an article and need to be prepared for a discussion in class. So they really need to define, why are they reading? What are they looking for? It helps give a focus and a goal. This is something, chunking the chapter is not about necessarily building context, but planning is very, very important as well. A lot of the students I talk to, and you can let me know in the chat if you've heard this as well, when I ask them, so you want to sit down, you want to read a chapter of a textbook, how do you do that? Do you spread it out? And they say, no, I try to read the whole thing in one sitting. Can anyone else, you could let me know in the chat, like, yeah, do you hear your students say things like that? I see some of y'all nodding. If I can see your heads, I see you nodding. Yeah, so we hear, and yes, I'm getting a couple yeses coming through for sure, right? And so that's one of the other things that I really caution students against there is a lot of information. And you're right, Pam, they do it like that because they want to get it over with. But there's a lot of information packed in these texts, right? There's a lot to really digest, and they need to give themselves the opportunity to digest it. And that's one of the ways I kind of try to sell them on using this process, is that I say, you know, you want your time to be used well, right? If you read the whole chapter in one sitting, but you don't remember most of what's going on, was that time well spent? You know, and they'll go, no. And I'm like, don't you want the time that you're spending with this to really stick with you, to get something out of it? And they're like, yeah. So that's one of the ways I try to talk to students about this, but chunking out the chapter is a really good way to do it. So they need to consider, what do I need to read? And divide that text into manageable sections. This is another opportunity to use the structure of the text as a guide. So you could say, all right, I want to, if they have a textbook like this, say, all right, I feel like I want to read these 2 sections. I feel like I can manage these 2 sections, and I'll do a comprehension check, and then I'm going to give myself a break. And then I'll do another 2 subsections. Or maybe they'll do 2 or 3 subsections a day and give themselves a couple of days in order to cover a chapter. That's a kind of individual conversation that we have with students about, you know, are you taking a quiz after this? Are you using this to better understand lectures? Again, getting back to that purpose of, why are you reading this text? Yes, and I see Taylor said oftentimes they get burnt out or bored with the subject. That's another reason why it's good to chunk the text, makes it less overwhelming. And I think a lot more manageable and enjoyable if you only have to kind of do bite size at a time. And then again, this is also a little bit different. So this isn't directly connected to the text, but I just feel like it's a very important thing to address with students. When I ask them about how what their reading process is, I encourage them to share things about time of day, environment, things like that, because those all have an impact. Y'all acknowledged it yourselves, right? You might be comfortable on the couch or on the deck, you know, enjoying some tea or snacks while you're reading something for recreational fun. But when it comes to academic reading, I saw several people say, I'm at a desk, right? You're not in that comfortable chair anymore. And students need to kind of understand that as well. So ask them, you know, what is the lighting like? You know, when are you set? A lot of them, I hear a lot of my students say, oh, I always do that at the end of the day. And it's because kind of what some of y'all were saying, they're kind of trying to, it's something they don't really enjoy, so they save it for the end of the day. And I say, well, when do you do your best work? You know, do you do that, you know, in the middle of the afternoon, earlier in the morning? And I try to kind of talk to them about maybe shifting when they do some of their reading if it's more beneficial for them. Noise is important as well, and so is temperature. So having a conversation with students about their environment in which they're trying to read is important for them before they get reading as well. So those are some of our pre-reading strategies that we share with students at CAS. At this point, does anyone have any questions on any of those strategies or things we've covered so far? You can feel free to drop those in the chat if you have a question at this point. Oh, good. Thank you, Bahar. So, okay, then we're going to go ahead and move on to some strategies that they can do while they're reading. So they have a good environment, they have skimmed, they have prepared, they've created a bit of context, they've planned out their reading. The next thing to do is be active. That's the big thing. As y'all all acknowledge, a lot of students, like when they read, you can kind of see they're not moving their eyes a lot, or maybe they're kind of looking off to the side. One of the key things during reading is that students need to be active. And yes, that's something, this is one of the reasons why I don't always say annotating is great, because I do love annotating, and you'll see actually something in a bit that addresses that. But a lot of students, yeah, if you tell them to highlight what's important, they'll highlight the whole page. So one of the things we do tell students is to paraphrase or take notes. They could use something like Cornell strategy, outline strategy. We will talk to students in a moment about kind of how they prefer to take notes. I have found one of the most helpful things is to actually go through the book with them, like especially if you're talking about how to take notes, because I'll have students ask me, how do I know what's important? And so I'll say, okay, let's look at your book together. And like I had that student come in and he brought a scholarly article with him. Or over Zoom, they have an online text, open it up, share your screen, let's look at it together and talk about it. And again, that comes back at like, let's look at the subheading. What do you need to know about this subject in your class? Look at the first line of every paragraph, get an idea of what the topics are going to be that's covered. So this is a really good opportunity to actually walk through these steps with students to talk about how they could translate into paraphrasing or notes. Now, the next strategy that we have is something called metacognitive markers. And this is basically a system for annotation, but I don't like to tell students to annotate because as someone who taught high school for 8 years, like I said, what ends up happening is a lot of what you saw in the during reading slide where there's lots and lots of highlighting, but not a lot kind of beyond that. So metacognitive markers are basically a system that students can use to show their thoughts as they're reading. So it's a good idea, like they use a question mark if they are unsure of something, starring key ideas, things that are important, underlining key terms, checking things off that make sense, they feel good about that particular content. I really love a strategy like this, especially for something if students are supposed to be reading an article and preparing for a discussion in class. I really think metacognitive markers are a great strategy for something like that in particular. It's also something that's like not overwhelming. Some students might feel overwhelmed if they feel like they need to do a lot of different things as they're reading. So this is a really good entry point as well if you have someone who is a little bit more reluctant to participate in some of these during reading strategies. Yeah, it reminds me of a bullet journal method. Yeah, absolutely. Something else that's a really good idea is to answer questions that are embedded in the chapter or text. So this is really more for those problem-based textbooks. So say in a math textbook, they may have a math textbook where there's very little text. Most of them do have text, but what's going to be outweighed are going to be examples, are going to be solution explanations, and then some practice questions. So as they read, it's a really good idea if that's the kind of subject they're looking at to answer those embedded questions that are in the text as they go through the sections. It's just going to be a good, quick comprehension, and they can kind of look at the solutions as they go. And then we also have post-reading strategies. So this is when they have finished their reading, and the next part, the real key thing with post-reading strategies is that they need to be checking their comprehension. So I would just like to ask y'all to share in the chat, when you see your students finish reading, what do they do? What is it, what do they, what do you see them doing? Do you see them checking themselves? Like kind of what do you see students do as they finish reading? Shut the book and walk away. Never look at the chapter again. Exactly, yep. I see some people, relief, sign in relief, oh no. Yeah, see, not doing it, yeah, doing nothing. Use what they need to get the assignment done and run away. Okay, so those are great responses because that's spot on, right? This is something we're seeing a lot of students do because it's such a monumental task. Yeah, a lot of them are trying to just get away with it. I did it, I'm done with it, moving on. But what we really want them to do is check their comprehension. They need to really see, again, I kind of try to sell it as, is the time you're spending on this, are you getting out of it what you need? And so a couple of post-reading strategies. The simplest, most straightforward one is to, at the end of the chapter, if they're reading a textbook chapter, is to then answer those questions at the back of that chapter. And so there's a lot of resources and a lot of ways to do this. In fact, this screenshot that I grabbed right here is from the Mastering Biology textbook, which is an online textbook that has a ton of resources in a lot of different ways that they can check their understanding. There's a practice test at the end of every chapter. So they can take that practice test and see how they do to check their comprehension for that particular chapter. So that's one way they can do it. Another way they can do it is to go back to those subheading questions. So remember in the pre-reading, one of the things I said they could do is turn those subheadings into questions. Well, as they finish their reading, answer those subheading questions. They could even go to looking at, this textbook calls them core objectives, or the learning objectives for the chapter. Explain those key learning objectives. If they need to trace historical events after reading a particular chapter in a history textbook, get out a sheet of paper or pull up something on the laptop and actually trace out those historical events. See if you have achieved those learning objectives that way. So answering those subheading questions, explaining those key learning objectives, seeing if they can answer those. Those are two really good ways, especially if they're dealing with a text that doesn't have questions at the end. Scholarly articles don't have questions at the end. So this is a good way of checking their comprehension in a different format. Another good thing they could do is to identify the big key ideas and then to write them in their own words. Sometimes students will take tons and tons of notes or do a lot of highlighting like we mentioned before, but they've kind of missed the big idea. Like what is the overriding important concept here? This is really good again for like especially articles and things like that. Like what is, I call it like the biggest takeaway. I'm going to ask you about that even at the end of the presentation. But what is the most important concept that the author is trying to get across here? So this can work in textbooks, but I also find this very, very good for articles and things like that as well. And then another option is to make what we call a concept map. Some people, I've also heard them called mind maps. In the links, in the link that I provided, one of the documents in that folder is our handout on concept maps. And that is something we do share with students. But making a concept map is a really good way to check understanding as well. And this is really something that can be done in any type of text. So I would say a concept map could look like this if it comes from, a science-based textbook, focusing on those relationships amongst information. This is a really good check on understanding. Not only did you get the basics of what something is, but do you understand how it relates to the other parts and other sections of the book? So especially if you have a student who likes creating visuals, this is a really good option to present them with, is something like a concept map. And then another one is, this is for if they are working in texts that have a lot of problems in them, like so a math textbook, perhaps. They can, what we do something called logging example problems, where essentially if they have example problems in the textbook provided, or if they have, maybe examples from lecture classes, if they can explain why the steps are happening in that particular problem. Because as we know, a lot of students, especially when it comes to problem-based classes like math or even chemistry, where they have to solve things, students will remember steps, but they don't necessarily remember the concept. So a good check on conceptual understanding could be doing that explanation of the steps instead of just solving the problems. So that's another thing that students can do to check their comprehension of content as they go through their reading. And then the last one is to combine their notes for the textbook with their class notes. This is one that I think a lot of my students that I talk to, they really gravitate towards this one because to them, it makes the most direct sense. The textbook has a lot of information, probably a bit more than what they're being offered in the lecture class. So if they have their lecture notes out and then they create their own notes from their reading, another good activity when they're done with their reading is to get those lecture notes out, look at the two sets, and then combine them to create one set that has, where they filled in any gaps that they feel like they had from the lecture notes, expanding on explanations, giving additional examples, the things that they found most useful from the textbook that help them understand content, pulling those all together so they have a good cohesive set of notes that really helps them understand the content. So this is one, I think probably most of the students I talk to, they really gravitate towards this particular strategy. That just seems to make the most sense to them. And so what do we really kind of do? What did we do with this? So these are the strategies we share with students. And what we did is we condensed them all into a chart to get them all together. And we have a couple of places where this is available to students. This is available to students on our Moodle course that we've created that shares a lot of our learning strategies with students. This is also available with our study cycle that we've created. But I would say probably the best thing to use these reading strategies with students is in one-on-one coaching, because you really get to have that conversation. You really kind of, like I said, have them share, you know, a text. There's students, if they come in, whenever we go back to in-person coaching, if they come into my office, they say, you know, I would like to learn about reading strategies, but they don't have anything with them. We've got a textbook here, and I open it up and go through it with them. So we use this chart with students as well in coaching, and that's really our opportunity to go through the process with them and show them. Because I think that's really kind of, I believe that's what really drives it home the best for students, seeing it kind of modeled, walking it through, seeing it applied to the text that they're actually going to be working with. This is also available in the file that I shared with y'all. Okay, and then so what I would like to invite y'all to do in the chat is to share what is your biggest takeaway. I do know, I would say probably my own personal biggest takeaway, just as we thought about reading strategies and creating this and putting this together for our students, was I think there's a lot of assumptions that students in higher education don't necessarily maybe need like direct concrete reading strategies. And it's really just become clear that this is a need that students have and just a place where we need to meet them. So I think that was one of my biggest takeaways, just working on this and working on some of our creation of these reading strategies. Yes, that students need a structured way to read, for sure. I think that's a really good takeaway, for sure. Students need to understand that academic reading needs a different process. I love that. That's actually how I open my conversation with reading with a lot of them, after I kind of ask them how they read and if it is different in any way. And then I say, this needs a different process. Let's talk about that process. So that's a really good point. And the strategies are super helpful, but even the power of reflection, absolutely, making them think about how they learn best, read, and also relax. Yes, actually, I do think giving them like these strategies and a process does help them relax a little bit about the reading process as well. Breaking it down into manageable steps, absolutely. And students need to understand how to find the information that is important, and that will help them going forward in the course rather than trying to remember everything. Yep. One-on-one is best for developing and introducing reading and reading strategies. It is hard virtually. We do offer online coaching, which is why I love, so we can look at some of these online resources like Mastering Biology. So if they can't pull something up, we might pull something up and share the screen. But yeah, it does make it a little bit more difficult. You kind of have to figure a way around that. And then how to take most out of academic reading, very helpful strategies. Good, I'm glad you found them helpful. Okay. So then I would just kind of like to wrap this up with just to kind of share, if you are, again, interested in contacting me, asking about any materials or anything like that, my email address, ahammons1@lsu.edu. Also, if you just want to, look at our center, some of the things we offer, lsu.edu/CAS, you can check that out there to look at descriptions of our services and tips and resources that we offer students. So we have some time for questions. If anyone has a question, you please feel free to drop that in the chat. Rosie, I don't know if you also wanted to show the QR code.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to pull up another PowerPoint. It's going to have a QR code for a survey for this presentation. And if you guys haven't done this for any other presentations you've attended, this code should bring you to the survey where you'll be able to do surveys for all of the presentations that you've attended. So please be sure to do surveys for all of the ones that you have attended so far and the ones that you'll continue to attend later this afternoon.
So once you've completed that survey, you are welcome to go ahead and exit the session. But also, please, I'll be here for till 12 if needed, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. So you can take a minute to do the survey and ask a question, or go ahead and ask a question, then do the survey. Either is fine, but thank y'all so much for attending. Y'all had really great participation and I appreciate that a lot. It's always helpful to hear back from people and to see their thoughts, and you know, it's always nice to see like kind of everyone's on the same page and seeing a lot of the same things. So you're very welcome, Heidi. You're welcome, Gloria.